Shields up, Ironbreakers. Rurikhan here coming at you with another video, and today we're going to be talking about Final Fantasy VII Remake. This title was sent to me by Square Enix so that I could give it a look and tell you guys my opinions on it. Now, throughout this video, I'm only going to be showing footage up until Chapter 3, including some of the side quests that take place in Chapter 3, and it's not like this is a limitation that was imposed upon me, it's just something that I decided to do in order to keep the video as spoiler-free as possible. Because this game is very much a big cinematic experience, there's a lot of cutscenes, there's a lot of iconic boss fights that people will recognize if you played the original, and some people might want to know more about that, some people might not, so, I figured, look, let's just keep the footage up until Chapter 3, keep spoilers up to a minimum so that the most amount of people can watch this without getting spoiled large chunks of the game. If you don't want to watch any gameplay at all, feel free to just minimize the window and listen in the background, that's fine too. If you want to watch more gameplay, keep in mind that I streamed this whole thing over on Twitch, and I will be uploading it to the secondary channel in case you guys want to watch the playthrough there. So just to let you guys know. Now, before we begin with the actual video, I should mention that I never played the original Final Fantasy VII, because at the time I did not have a PlayStation console, and in my earlier years I wasn't even that much into gaming because my parents were kind of strict with that type of stuff. They wanted to avoid me becoming addicted to video games, so I just wasn't able to get to it, even though I planned on eventually doing so because I would always hear people talk about it with great reverence and saying that Final Fantasy VII, one of the greatest RPGs ever made, which actually makes me think that remaking this particular Final Fantasy must have been a complete nightmare. Because it's like, if you change too many things, the old fans are going to be very upset. And if you don't change enough, you might end up with the game that might be a little bit too hard for people to get into. So I can't even imagine what the nightmare must have been of developing this whole thing. And when you think about it, it's a nightmare that it isn't even over yet because, as you know, this is going to be a game that is going to span over multiple installments. Like, this is just the first part of Final Fantasy VII, the one that we're getting now. We're also probably going to get part 2, part 3. I actually don't know how many parts it's going to be. I suppose that 3 will be a nice round number, but we just don't know. Now, this is a game that is going to inevitably upset a lot of people because it's taking a classic and it's changing certain aspects of it. It's changing the combat, it's changing the visuals, it's changing portions of the story, and this is going to cause some people to actually really like it because they'll enjoy re-experiencing a game that they've experienced over 20 years ago, and some people to hate it because they will experience a game that they've experienced 20 years ago, but it's very different. So the question becomes, where do I, a newcomer to this franchise, sit in the middle of all this? Well, after finishing the game about 2 days ago now, I think, I have to say I greatly enjoyed my experience throughout the game right up until the end. At which point it completely lost me because, like I said, I'm a newcomer to this series, but I'm gonna get a little bit deeper into this when we talk about the story portion of the video. Naturally, this is still not going to have spoilers, it's just, this is just the introduction, so let's take it nice and easy, okay? Now, when it comes to playtime, I think I wrapped up my save at around 45 hours, but I did do a lot of the side quests, and I spent a lot of time learning the intricacies of the materia system, to avoid making a fool of myself by saying something utterly ridiculous like normal mode is too hard and easy mode is too easy, because that'd be a dumb thing to say, right? Anyway, if you beeline the story, I think you're looking at around 25 to 30 hours of game time. But what does the game feel like, you might ask? And I think that I would describe it as the Uncharted version of Final Fantasy VII. I'm talking about Uncharted the game. The experience is very much a linear experience from beginning to end, with a little room to explore and do some side quests in between some of the chapters. It's all very cinematic, with players experiencing seamless transitions between combat, cutscenes, story exposition, and repeat. The overworld of the game, which is essentially the city of Midgar, can even feel a little claustrophobic at times because most of the areas consist of corridors with arenas and quest hubs in between. But the industrial facilities that you visit, kind of like the dungeons during the main scenario, are actually pretty sweet and very well designed overall. However, if you were expecting a more open world style of game to explore the city of Midgar, this is not it. The structure and pacing is very much, like I said previously, similar to that of Uncharted, though naturally with a very different combat system, but we're also going to get deeper into that when we get into the gameplay portion of this video. As per usual with my videos, I like to talk about visuals, and then sound, then story, and then gameplay, so strap yourselves in as we go into visuals. Visually, the game looks great whenever the focus is on the main characters or areas that are important to the main scenario. When you look at random NPCs, however, it's a bit of a different story. I seem to remember this was also the case for Final Fantasy XV, so I'm not particularly surprised by this fact. Sometimes it also appears that certain textures fail to load, which end up looking pretty jarring in cutscenes where characters are beautifully rendered talking in front of a door that just didn't feel like rendering its texture properly. Overall though, it's not really a deal breaker unless you're a stickler for that kind of thing. Animations are beautifully done both in cutscenes as well as in combat, particularly some of the more over-the-top animations. I happen to be a fan of that kind of thing, so those really struck well for me. The game is a real feast for the eyes most of the time, and performance-wise you're looking at the usual 30 FPS, but it felt very consistent on my PlayStation 4 Pro. Naturally, your mileage may vary depending if you're using a Pro or the base model PS4. I never really felt like performance negatively impacted me during gameplay or broke my immersion during cutscenes. However, I should probably mention that the camera could do with a bit of work. There were several situations where I found myself backed up into a corner when I'm fighting an enemy. The enemy is just like overwhelming the entire field of view. I can't rotate the camera properly because maybe I'm locked in. Then again, maybe I'm not, and sometimes it can get really messy with the camera. It can get hard for you to target enemies that are off the screen. There's a little bit of tweaking that you can do to help you during these situations in the options of the game and stuff like that, but even after you tweak everything out, and there can be situations where an enemy just like pushes you into the corner and you can't really see where your character is. You can't even see if you're blocking. You can't see if you're in Punisher stance, which doesn't allow you to block it gets a little bit messy. So, the camera could still do with a bit of work. And can we please, for the love of God, get a brightness setting? Some sections in this game are extremely dark. And if you happen to be using HDR, which dramatically increases the contrast, the range of colors, and all of this stuff, there can be certain sections where, there are these enemies that do like this red lightning thing, and it obfuscates the entirety of the screen. Like, all you see is just like red lightning everywhere. You can't see your characters, you can't see the enemies. So it's just like, please, a brightness setting. Thank you.
Who's there? Door! Oh, wait! It's over!
That's my line.
He's alone! We can take it! Make it rain!
Now let's talk about sounds, and in here there isn't really that much to say. All of the sounds are great, from the clanking of blades to gunshots to punches and spells. Every single one of them felt just right. Now, I greatly enjoyed the soundtrack. The remasters of older tracks really brought the game to life for me. Although I don't really have any nostalgia for Final Fantasy VII, so I don't know how a fan would feel about some of these new tracks. The voice acting, in my opinion, is outstanding. I played the whole thing in English, and it felt great. I'm now going through hard mode with Japanese voices to check out what those sound like, and I actually think I prefer the English version, which is something that is very rare when you're talking about a Japanese developed game that I would like, oh yeah, the English voice, they actually sound good enough that I would rather hear those. Particularly Barrett. Like, Barrett is night and day. The English version of Barrett versus the Japanese version, it's not even a contest for me. But you know, to each his own. Basically, I enjoyed the voice acting.
The hell you think's gonna happen when it's all gone, huh? Answer me! You gonna stand there and pretend you can't hear the planet crying out in pain? I know you can!
You really hear that?
Damn straight I do!
Get help.
Now let's get into the story, and this right here is where the fans are most definitely going to be divided. I'm going to start off by saying that I greatly enjoyed the story all the way, like I said earlier, until the final cutscenes. Now, whether the original story is better or worse, it's not for me to decide, but the story that is presented in the remake itself was firing on all cylinders for me, right up until those final sequences, and I completely lost track of what the hell is even happening right now. Because we all know that Final Fantasy VII is a narrative that is going to be split across several games, so I was expecting them to work around the story and reach a somewhat satisfying conclusion, and then just give us a small taste of the adventures to come in the future releases. But instead of doing that, the ending section just goes completely off the rails and gives you no sense of closure on the story arc you were just experiencing. At least it definitely didn't do that for me. Now, like I said, I didn't play the original game, however, I did have several Final Fantasy VII hardcore fans in my Twitch chat as I was playing this title. And as I advanced in the story, they would discuss amongst themselves some of the differences between the remake and the original. So I was very surprised to learn from my Twitch chat that the ending fundamentally changes the story of the original Final Fantasy VII. I thought this was going to be a retelling of the story with additional details and stuff like that. But according to what people were telling me, the story just completely changes from the original, which actually takes the game more into the territory of what I would consider to be a reboot than necessarily a remake. But, you know, it's all a little overwhelming as someone who still hasn't played the original, which is why I plan on playing it as soon as my copy arrives. Unfortunately, the thing that's happening in the world right now, which I can't say the actual name because I'm not a late night show host, this thing has actually delayed the shipping of my Final Fantasy copy, so basically I'll have to wait for a good long while. But ultimately, just be aware that the ending is going to change things, and where we go from there, it's gonna be anyone's guess.
Get down here, Merc.
Now let's get into the meat of things. Let's talk about the gameplay and how do you transform a turn-based game into an action title and still manage to retain some of that original feel of Final Fantasy VII during its combat. Well, I don't know, but considering how often I found myself juggling the ATB system, I'd actually wager it will feel extremely familiar to most OG Final Fantasy VII fans. My most impactful combat decisions were usually made in the menus, in the abilities that I was using or the spells that I was choosing to cast. Now make no mistake, the action part of the combat is most definitely important. Recognizing boss patterns, the attacks that they use, when to counter, when to dodge, when to block, everything matters because you need to be able to hit these bosses with your real-time moves, you know, your regular attacks or basic attacks. You need to be able to dodge, you need to be able to block in order to generate ATB, which are, I believe, active time battle points. And then these ATB points are going to allow you to unleash your special attacks. Now on the surface, this is going to seem like a simple system, right? You build up a gauge, then you unleash a special attack, but that is before you add materia into the mix. Now, earlier I mentioned that this game felt like the Uncharted version of Final Fantasy VII, but that doesn't mean it doesn't take its RPG roots seriously. There's plenty of min-maxing for you to engage in through the materia system combined with the gear, weapon leveling mechanics, and the characters currently available to you. So let's analyze these different systems, and we're going to start with the weapons. There are no real throwaway weapons in this game. Every single weapon in the game has a sphere grid of skills that you can invest points in. So technically speaking, you can level up and materia mod Cloud's Buster Sword to last you the entirety of the game, or any other weapon you find or buy for any of the other characters in the game. All of those weapons are basically endgame viable. They're just going to provide you with different playstyles because each of the individual weapons is going to have a different sphere grid. Some of them will be better for casting spells, others might be better for melee combat, and some will be more defensive, while others might excel while you're low on health. But beyond all of these variables, the most important thing that each weapon has is a special skill attached to it. And using that weapon is going to allow you to master that skill so that eventually you can use it with other weapons. So if you want as many ATB skills as possible to have more choices during combat, you're going to have to play with several different weapons across all of the different characters. So now let's shift gears a little bit into materia. Materia is essentially a gem with a skill. There's multiple types of materia. Some of the skills in materia are going to be active skills that you can cast as an ATB action, whereas others are going to be passive, like increasing your health pool, increasing your mana pool, etc., etc. So let's say, for instance, you want Cloud to be able to shoot fireballs. You're going to equip Cloud with a fire materia. If, on the other hand, you want Cloud to be able to heal, you're going to equip him with a healing materia. As you play through the game, these materia, the more you use them, they're going to level up, and they give you access to different spells. So for instance, with the fire materia, you start off by just, being able to throw a very basic fireball. It's a spell called Fire. Then eventually you can throw a more powerful fireball. It's called Fire. And then there's the Fire Ga, which, I'm not super familiar with Final Fantasy spells. Go ahead, criticize me all you want. But basically, the higher you go on the tree, the more powerful the spell becomes. But different materia might have different things to it. So for instance, with the Thunder materia, you have a very basic Thunder when you start off, but then on the second level you have Thundara, which is basically an AoE version of it. And, that's kind of like how spells work. This is just like a very basic look. The same thing happens with healing materia. You start off by having basic Cure. Then you get Cura, which heals more. Then you get Regen, which heals you over time. Then you get Kuraga, which is a massive friggin' heal, right? And, these are just the way that materia evolves. So it's important for you to level up different materia through different characters to be able to have more powerful spells available to you. Now, each of these characters is going to have 3 equipment slots, which consist of a weapon, a piece of gear, and a charm. Now, the weapon and the gear piece are going to have materia slots for you to fill with materia that you will find or buy throughout the game. Materia can be freely swapped around, so you can optimize your setup around different encounters as you see fit. So for instance, if you're fighting an ice enemy, you might want to make sure that you equip at least one character with fire materia. If you are fighting a fire enemy, you might want to, equip one character with ice materia. Certain monsters are going to be vulnerable to ice, so again, you want to use ice on them. Other monsters will be vulnerable to lightning. You want to use lightning on them, although usually machines are the ones that are vulnerable to lightning. But basically, you guys get the idea. Materia can just be swapped around. There's no commitment like when you're putting a fire materia into Cloud's sword. It's not like, okay, Cloud's a fire mage now. It's just like, no, for this encounter, Cloud's going to be able to cast fire. And, immediately after this, I can swap things around and Cloud is now a lightning type dude, But naturally, there's going to be skills in your weapons that will benefit more through the use of certain material. Like certain weapons might have, for instance, elemental damage bonuses. Those will be good for casting. So, you have to play around with it and juggle the materia that you use with the weapon that you are using and the skills that you apply to that weapon. Now, eventually, you're also going to be able to combine materia in your gear, which will allow you, for instance, to imbue your weapons with elemental damage by slotting fire materia with an elemental damage materia into linked slots into your weapon. So not only there's materia slots, there's linked materia slots, and those allow you to do some pretty cool things. Like a really good combo, for instance, that I wasn't even aware that you could do until I was, 30 hours in, is you can combine healing materia with another materia that you pick up, which is called magnifying materia. And what this does is it essentially allows you to cast AoE heals. So every time you heal a party member, everybody gets a heal, which is a really good combo that I'd advise you guys to use. Now, one of the things that I found quite interesting about this particular system is that basically players that are well versed in the mechanics of the original Final Fantasy VII will be better equipped to handle combat in the remake, because they will know what materia does what and what materia combines well with what, because all of these things seem to be, brought over from the original Final Fantasy. They will also be aware of what moves are particularly powerful and when to use them, which is really, really cool. Summons also come from materia, but they have their unique dedicated slot, so they don't really take up space in the weapon. Each weapon can only equip one summon, and I'm still not entirely clear on what the conditions are for summons to become available. No, they're not available at all times. The in-game manual says, when facing a formidable foe in battle, the entity slumbering within an equipped summoning materia may begin to stir, which means nothing. I've noticed summons triggering sometimes when I stagger enemies and sometimes when I'm low on health, but beyond that, it's pretty much anyone's guess. They don't work like Final Fantasy XV though, they're not random. Once a summon is triggered, you have control over when to use it or not use it, and you can then spend ATB to issue commands to it. Once summoned, the entity stays in battle and fights alongside you for a short period of time, and once that time ends, it's going to unleash a final high damage attacks and then leaves. You can only summon once per battle. At least that was my experience. Beyond the old school stuff, the remake also introduces a much more common mechanic into its action combat in the form of the stagger gauge, which is a system that rewards players for repeatedly exploiting the weakness of a particular enemy and essentially stunning it for a brief period of time, allowing the party to go all out. So usually when you're fighting a common enemy, you can just attack it repeatedly and it will slowly fill up this stagger gauge, and eventually that enemy will get fully staggered, and this will increase the amount of damage that you can deal to it for a brief period of time, and the enemy will not block, will not counterattack, will not do anything, while your party just goes completely mental on it. However, this is how they introduce certain mechanics on different bosses. So certain bosses might not even be affected by the stagger gauge unless you perform a specific action or cast a specific spell of a certain element that counters, the element of that boss, and that might slowly fill up its stagger gauge to eventually allow you to deal more damage and give you openings and all that stuff. The way in which the stagger gauge is used is basically set up to reward players for thoughtful play, which is why I said earlier, a lot of the decisions that I make in combat are in the menu. Thinking about, okay, so this particular enemy, it's going to be weak to fire, so can I cast fire with Cloud? Can I, maybe use some kind of fire-imbued weapon that I might have and use that instead? Can I use a different spell that's not just a fire spell and use something else, And you really start thinking about the tactics around the stagger gauge. As a matter of fact, I did my build pretty much around the stagger gauge to stagger as quickly as I possibly could, and then just capitalize by beating the crap out of people that are staggered with a special ability that deals additional damage, because there's modifiers like that and stuff. So in case you guys were worried that there was not going to be enough RPG in your Final Fantasy VII Remake, you don't need to. There's plenty of numbers to play around with, and each character can be played in multiple different ways. And you will play multiple characters, because focusing on playing only as Cloud is not really an option if you're playing in normal difficulty. Not to mention that in certain story sections, Cloud is quite simply not playable. The game is designed to allow you to quickly swap between characters, and it expects you to do so in order to maximize your combat potential. The ATB system does allow you to issue orders to characters you're not controlling, but the AI for your companions is very inefficient, and they will only resort to the occasional basic attacks and blocking, which essentially means you'll usually get to 4 or 5 ATB actions in a character you're controlling before your AI companions fill their first ATB gauge. So you better get used to swapping characters until you can apply some materia to mitigate the AI's shortcomings. Statfast materia being a great option, which is going to grant them ATB for blocking, which is what they do most of the time when they're left to their own devices. I should also mention that you never really get to choose your party composition during the main story, so it's going to be important to understand the mechanics of each character and keep them properly geared up. Having said all that, the combat still feels extremely fun. The boss fights feel very epic, and in normal difficulty, they actually require to learn the boss's weaknesses and capitalize on them. The abilities you get while you navigate the story, combined with the materia and the innate character abilities, make for a very satisfying combat experience despite its shortcomings. But naturally, there's more to gameplay than combat and progression, so let's talk a little bit about the campaign structure. The main scenario is pretty much a linear experience. The game hits the ground running and doesn't really stop until the third chapter. It's a roller coaster ride of combat scenes, cutscenes, and boss fights, and it's a pretty sweet ride, but when it stops, it's side quest time. And the side quests are about as good as the random NPC characters, you know, the way that they look. They get the job done, but most are not super entertaining, like go here, kill a few mobs, find some cats, kill some more mobs, do this minigame, yada yada yada. Which is all fine and well. I mean, particularly for people that enjoy the combat, like was my case, it's not really a big deal to go out and kill some more stuff because, you know, it's a fun combat system, and when you get used to it, you start really enjoying it. So sure, having an excuse, go out, kill a couple of more things, but ultimately, a lot of them do end up feeling like busy work. However, they do serve to add a lot of flavor and background to the game world because, you know, they give you a little bit more information about what's going on, about the type of characters that, you know, inhabit the city of Midgar. But ultimately, they end up feeling a lot like a bit of filler content in between some of the chapters of the main story. Having said that, though, completing them is very much worthwhile in terms of your personal progression because you might get powerful materia or other meaningful upgrades, and completing all of the side quests, for instance, in Chapter 3, is going to give you access to a special cutscene with another character. The game is at its best during the main scenario, while you're experiencing the story, fighting bosses, and just soaking in the atmosphere of Final Fantasy VII, which is something that, like I said, I never played the original, so soaking the atmosphere of the industrial Midgar and all of the stuff that happens around the city is a really cool setting that I find very unique, and I greatly enjoyed it. The side quests, on the other hand, can break up the pacing a little, but at the same time, if they weren't there, the pacing might just feel a little bit too fast and you'd barely have any time to process some of the story beats. Despite the few shortcomings I just mentioned though, I still very much enjoyed my time in this remake, and I would actually recommend it to anyone who enjoyed the demo. Just be aware of my previous remarks in regards to how different the story is from the original. So what about replayability though? Well, when you finish the game, you get to replay the different chapters in any order that you want, while retaining your current gear and abilities so that you can go and, you know, do anything that you might have missed during your original playthrough. There's also a new difficulty mode which unlocks more upgrades for your character and your party. So basically, whenever you pick each of these chapters that you want to play through, you can pick an additional difficulty called Hard. However, this difficulty mode is only available on your current save file that you finished the game in, where you have all of your characters leveled up and progressed, and, you know, everything is optimized to the nth degree. So basically, you can't start a fresh game on a hard mode and re-experience the progression throughout the game, which was a little disappointing for me because I was actually looking forward to playing through it again now that I was much better versed in the game's mechanics, particularly the materia system that when I started I was like, what the crap is all of this, right? Now I'm still playing through it in a hard mode though, in a chronological order with my souped up characters because I still want to experience the hard mode. And one of the things that I noticed is that at least it's nice to see that they changed some of the bosses slightly, giving them new attacks and changing up some of their existing ones, keeping the encounters a little fresh. So for instance, the Scorpion Tank boss that you guys might have played in the demo, he's going to get a couple of different things, like a special attack called Overkill that just deals a ton of damage, fires missiles all over the place, and if you're not blocking by the time he fires this attack, you're dead. His tail laser now shoots twice instead of just once, and you have to use both fields of debris as cover, and a couple of more changes here and there that I'll leave you guys to figure out for yourselves. But again, this would have been something that would have been really cool to experience in a fresh save file, to go through all of the progression and struggles again. But you know, maybe in an update they'll do something about that. That'd be really cool, Square Enix, pretty please. But anyway, these are my thoughts on Final Fantasy VII Remake. At the end of the day, I greatly enjoyed my time with the game. It made me want to go back and play the original to learn more. I just wish the ending of it wasn't so convoluted that it made me completely lose track of the story. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the like button. If you did not enjoy this video, hit the dislike button because feedback is important. Feedback, which you can also leave in the comment section down below. If you usually enjoy my content, subscribe, hit the bell notification icon, all of that usual jazz. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one. Stay strong, and may your shields never break.